Welcome to DevEx Unpacked. I'm Alan Carson, co-founder and chief strategy officer at Cloudsmith. We're solving the challenges of artifact management and are on the path to becoming the software supply chain itself. In this weekly podcast, we share knowledge from Cloudsmith employees, customers, and other great guests from the software industry. Along the way, we'll unpack topics like the cloud, security, supply chains, and of course, the developer experience. Welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you here. Jack and I have known each other for a couple of years now, maybe 2 or 3 years, I would think. The podcast is called DevEx Unpacked, so it's all about developer experience. And Jack, you are the first external guest. We've recorded a few episodes now, but it's all been kind of internal, which is to kind of get me into the spirit of asking questions and figuring out all the technical details. But we thought that you would be a really good first external guest to kind of bring in, given that our paths have crossed in the past, and you actually did a bit of work for us at Cloudsmith a couple of years ago, and you are a prominent startup founder in the Northern Ireland ecosystem at this point. So I would love to hear a bit about your background and what your path was to becoming a CTO.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, Alan. Really good to be on the podcast. And as you say, it's always great to chat with you. Loved every conversation we ever had, and it was really great to be a very small part in helping Cloudsmith out. I think a couple of years ago now, bizarrely, which doesn't seem like that long ago. So my sort of entry into what I'm doing now was probably a little unorthodox, but I suppose that's how a lot of these journeys start. I did an aerospace engineering degree, and I was saying to someone recently, it was probably due to a lack of understanding of what a computer science actually was, or whether it even existed. Because I remember sitting there thinking about what degree I should do, and I wanted to keep lots of options open. I didn't really know what I wanted to do with my life, and chatting to someone saying, well, I like computers, I like solving problems, I like writing code. Any ideas? So big shrugs all around. So I thought, well, I'll do aerospace engineering because I quite like planes. And then 2 years into that, I enjoyed the course, but I did a placement year at Rolls-Royce. Found out that building jet engines is hard and slow, and there's a lot of safety involved, as there should be. And I'll come on to why I think there's maybe interesting.
Software sounds pretty similar.
There's no undo button on a jet engine in a test bed though. But
True.
But anyway, it's actually interesting. In all seriousness, there are lots of parallels. I now realize later on in my career, especially as a CTO, around like safety and QA and security, all those kind of things. So I think there was definitely something in that. But going back 15 years, I realized that I kind of wanted to be more closer to the tech. I kept finding myself gravitating towards like things like writing Visual Basic macros to make handling spreadsheets easier and solving those little rough edges, little bits of friction, on a computer rather than on a technical diagram or with a screwdriver. So I went back to finish my degree, but all the mine stuff, I'd realized at that point I didn't want to graduate and go back into the kind of job my placement was. So I sort of tweaked my final year modules slightly and did sort of a business module and actually an environmental science module, so that I'd still get all the credits to get my aerospace engineering degree, but with a few extra sort of modules plugged in, and became a technology consultant or management consultant really, but specializing in technology out of university. I can remember my first manager on like day 3 of joining Deloitte sort of said to me, have you ever written any Objective-C, as it was at the time, for iOS apps? I said, no. And he said, well, do you want to learn? I said, yes. And he said, right, well, here's a 2-week intense course online. Do that. And then and then we'll put you on a project. And yeah, more or less from then it was sort of hands-on, get stuck in, learn as you go. And sort of, yeah, about 12 years after doing that, I found myself in the CTO position for the second or third time, depending on how you measure it, I think.
And you actually have a CEO credit on your LinkedIn as well, right?
But I spent the sort of tail end of 2020 sort of as a solo founder, CEO, that was my CEO credit there, getting Grazi, which is a contactless tipping platform. I was trying to make micro sort of peer-to-peer payments easier. So I did that. That was great. It was a really good experience, but I realized that being a kind of solo founder, and especially a solo technical founder, was tough and pretty, unforgiving. And also I wasn't particularly good at marketing and sales. People sort of said, "Oh, you can bring that in, you can find the right people." And I was sort of midway through looking at doing that and thinking about doing a raise of sorts, when StrikePay, who were basically doing a very similar product to me, they're based in Dublin. I got a kind of intro from them. It was one of these intros where it was actually Ian Brown from Ignite said, "Have you seen these? Have you seen these guys?" I looked them up and I thought, "Oh no, um, very similar to what I'm doing," and they're a fair bit further ahead than I was. So it was one of those things where Ian said, "Have you seen these guys?" An hour later, I sent them a LinkedIn message cold saying, "Hey, look, we're in the same boat here. Should we have a chat?" They came back to me and said, "Let's have a call tomorrow morning." And I had an offer of an acquisition by the 24 hours later. Now it was very much an acqui-hire. Like, I mean, it was, it was that they had a gap in their tech and kind of engineering leadership, and I had every other gap other than that.
Well, a
So
good fit then,
it was a perfect fit for that. So it
Yeah.
worked really well. And I came in, brought some of my tech, but also helped get their tech on track,
Mhm.
helped them hire. They just raised a pre-seed round at that time, and went on to raise a seed round shortly after. Initially, I joined them as VP of engineering because they weren't sure, whether I was going to be
Right.
someone that could be in the CTO seat. But after a couple of months, they made me CTO, and that went really well actually. And we did that for about 18 months after that.
But that was good. That was good for us because then you started your consulting side of things, right?
Yeah, that's right. So after that, I was probably a bit burnt out and just looking to try something different. And I thought, well, I'll do sort of some consulting. I didn't really know what that would necessarily look like, but um, it was a combination of sort of fractional CTO work, and what I was doing for Cloudsmith, which was sort of in a specific, niche that needed some attention. I think it was sort of front end stuff I was looking at with Cloudsmith. And I really enjoyed that. I did that for about 15 months in total. The contracting. I was always making sure never to do more than 1 or 2 days a week per client, which was interesting because it kept things very sort of different. But it was a bit exhausting trying to sort of, spin all those plates. So, um, useful. And I guess it was a little bit of a kind of try before you buy in some sense, because right at the end of that, I mean, this is why it was right at the end of that. I was introduced to Control Alt, who were looking to hire a CTO, and actually was introduced to them by Michael Blakely, actually from Equitas.
Right.
He'd been approached by one of them to help them do hiring, help them do interviewing, and he put them in touch with me, and I was going to interview a series of CTO candidates. And we did a few interviews, and broadly, sort of feedback was that the people that they had in their pipeline were sort of more sort of good senior engineers than sort of engineering leaders. And
So
because
you were trying to hire the position that you ended up with,
yeah,
right?
exactly.
Wow.
So I mean, I did go into it sort of fully expecting to hire somebody that wasn't me. Um, then after probably a month of doing, I don't know, maybe somewhere between 5 and 8 sort of interviews, they'd kind of all come back with me not, saying this would be a good hire for an engineer, but I don't think it's who you want in the leadership team. I said, look, do you want me to do this fractionally for, a couple of days a week until we fill the gap? And by this point, I was sort of really falling in love with the problem, and the team were just, really onto something. They just raised a decent seed round. So it was sort of, I kind of thinking, I hope maybe there's a full-time role here. Unfortunately, they then said, would you be interested in a full-time role? And probably had said yes before they'd finished answering the question.
Don't
I
be too eager.
no, I have to think about it, but yes.
Yeah.
And it's been great, actually. So we that was let me think. Then that was October 2023. So yeah, like over 18 months ago. And at that point, I think it was employee number 5. And we've just hit 30 this week. So we're now 30
Wow.
people, which is great, actually. And it's about half in Northern Ireland, predominantly product engineering. And then the other half, combination, roughly a third in that half, roughly, some remote, some in London, and some in Dubai. So it's really interesting. It's, we're going through all those sort of challenges that I know you've been through with things like ISO and, how you scale beyond, we've now had to have multiple engineering teams, and how do you manage multiple roadmaps and stuff. But really interesting, really, really sort of fun sort of time at the moment as we sort of try and grow.
That's amazing. I'm really pleased to hear that things are going well.
Yeah, thanks. It's good. It's
Uh,
nice.
yeah. So maybe give us a the pitch. What does Control Alt do?
Yeah, so Control is an alternative investment platform. So alternative investments are really anything that isn't traded traditionally on an exchange. So to take a step back, we're a fintech, and what would traditionally happen if somebody was wanting to buy sort of a large financial instrument, or any size financial instrument, like a share in a company, is they go through lawyers, they draw up a share purchase agreement, and they'd go through months of expensive legal work, and again, often that's one buyer, one seller. If you have 10 buyers, pretty much times that effort by 10, times that price by 10, or thereabouts. Um, what our platform allows people to do is to list traditional assets. They are then fractionalized and tokenized. So we use the blockchain for a very specific use case in this, which is to give a digital representation of a share, and then those can then be traded on our platform. So it's the way to think about it is it's sort of like building an exchange for trading alternative assets, but lowering the barriers for who can list assets and who can buy these assets. And yeah, it's interesting. We're doing quite a lot of work. A good example of alternative assets is property. So we're doing work at the moment to allow people to fractionalize property, which means that, rather than having one buyer, one seller, if you've got, a very valuable property in London, say you own the Gherkin, you could effectively fractionalize it and have 1,000 buyers each own 1/1,000th of the property.
Yeah. Right. Amazing.
Because it lowers the cost of that, but it also lowers the speed. Effectively, if you think about how easy it would be for me to transfer a cryptocurrency, or even regular currency through my banking app to you, we're trying to make it so that's the level of effort required to transfer my 1/1,000th of the Gherkin to you.
Right. Great. Amazing. So, like, I would love to dive in maybe a little bit around sort of you mentioned your developer teams and your product and engineering being in Northern Ireland. Are they all remote, or do you have an office?
We have an office actually in
Mm.
Belfast. So we would be very much hybrid. We have 3 engineers who are fully remote, but they are all based on the island of Ireland. So we're able to get together probably monthly with everyone. The rest of the team though are all hybrid, and we tend to be in the office sort of 2-3 days a week. Um, and that's been interesting. We've largely found that at our stage of sort of, how it is in those sort of early stages of really like iterating and pivoting and seeing what works and what doesn't, having people in a room around a whiteboard has been really helpful. We've also got a relatively junior team, so we've got about 5 graduates in the team. Um, and what we found is that just having that sort of mentorship of somebody who's sat, next to them effectively, who can sort of pair, do reviews, and just generally pick up on those sort of unspoken messages, you might get from people about body language, or if it looks like they're getting stuck on an issue, something stalled, then being able to intervene. So we found that the hybrid approach is working quite well for us at the moment. Interested to see how it scales.
Yeah, I mean, we are all remote now. Like, we do have an office, but it's like, and people do come into it for meetings, and like we have like Wednesdays usually. It's fairly full, but I mean, like there's some pot desking and everything from that perspective, but like not a lot of coding gets done in the office. I mean, all the coding gets done at home at this point. Um, so yeah, no, and as we have scaled, and like we have people now in island of Ireland, quite a few based in Belfast and surrounding areas, the UK, India, and the US. Those are our centers. And yeah, I mean, it's hard from the point of view of trying to keep. You don't want the remote people to feel like they've missed out. When that's the balance, is like, how do you get people together? And so we typically we do offsites 3 times a year, and then we do like product and engineering, like mini offsites for that team, or for those teams. That that seems to be working for us. But so we're about 88 people at this point. So um, the level of scale just magnifies everything.
Yeah, doesn't it? I mean, even I find that already, just those things that used to just take, it takes a minute per Mac, for example. And I go,
Hmm.
okay, well, that's 30 Macs now. That's half an hour. If it
Yeah.
does, little things that scale very quickly on that. Do you find like the levels get on okay with that mix as well? Like, do you have junior people that would be fully remote as well?
So we actually don't have a lot of junior people. We've kind of hired a bit higher up, sort of up the stack. We had like, so our like, we've got one guy starting this summer. He's a newly graduate, and he did a placement with us last summer. But we typically haven't been doing graduate programs or anything like that yet. I think we will, but it's been interesting. And I mean, actually, this is one of my questions for kind of later in the chat, but it might be worth talking about it now. Um, I'm sort of seeing a general trend in the industry of there's not a lot of jobs for graduates, and there's not a lot of placements floating around. And the excuse is AI has taken over a lot of kind of that sort of early stuff, that it's nearly easier to have an AI augmented senior engineer than it is to try and bring somebody in and junior, and train them up. And like, mean, it's an interesting paradigm for what's going to happen in the next, 3 to 5 years in terms of like, who's available and what they're doing. How have you been thinking about that in terms of your hiring strategy?
Yeah, it's a really good point. It's something we have been thinking about, and we've been trying to make sure, outside of hiring as a second, trying to make sure that our sort of strategy is to really like embrace AI where it can help us, but also not get sort of carried away by some of the hype. There obviously are huge benefits to some of the tooling. We use things like Cursor or Copilot or any of these tools just to have that almost like extra pair of eyes. Um, One thing that's kind of interesting I found actually is that we've had to be maybe a tiny bit careful on letting uh, some of the grads or people too early on in their career run too loose with these tools, in that if they don't get the right questions or the right setting for them, or they don't know the right way to kind of review the inputs and outputs, you can get some real garbage code in there, because uh, you know, they won't fully understand the assignment, and then of course rolled up in an AI tool that then misunderstands it a step further. Um, so we're trying to make sure that we don't let, it's not this sort of unguarded tool that people are given and not told how to use. So I'm actually trying to teach some of the grads and even the mid levels actually about like how to use these best for their to make them better engineers, rather than sort of people standing over a tool and not really understanding what's coming out of it. Um, in the hiring sense, yeah, it's interesting. We've almost looked at it the other way, rightly or wrongly, in that if we get some people that are early on in their career who perhaps have a real like desire to learn, um, a real interest in like the industry, but obviously they don't have years and years of experience. They maybe have, you know, 1 year experience or two at best, and are often fresh out of university. Then we're trying to think of as if we give them like some good coaching, so some good seniors around them, plus the tools like the AI tools that they can run with, and get that kind of feedback from those kind of very short loops using AI, then perhaps that means that we're getting, and obviously speaking slightly facetiously here, you're getting a senior for the price of a junior because you've enhanced them with those tools. Um, It'll be interesting to see how it all plays out on that. We've definitely found that if we put a graduate job out, we get hundreds and hundreds of applications. So I would definitely agree that there's a shortage of roles. And I've seen a lot of the big players in the industry sort of close up their graduate schemes, or at least reduce the numbers. And that's going to be interesting. And in the kind of optimist in me is thinking, well, that's an opportunity for us as a relatively unknown startup to get some of the people coming out with the top grades and the most impressive CVs, who may have gone to look at the big players and are now finding the doors shut, might come to smaller players. But it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And I suppose I want to point out that it's actually not our strategy to hire senior engineers and get them to use AI to replace juniors. That's not what we're trying to do. I think like our code base is pretty difficult, and and pretty multifaceted, and so we have just sort of been on this path of like trying to get people in to really raise the tide very, very quickly, and that has just sort of meant that we've gone a bit more senior at this point. I do think as we grow, I was very passionate about this kind of graduate program that we had at NYSE, because I really like people. I really like young people coming into the business and asking the questions and asking the hard questions, and like a lot of the time I would find, well, I actually don't know the answer to that, and I would have to run off and try and figure it out, and and like I kind of feel like sometimes when you bring in experienced people, they actually don't ask the hard questions. They just go off and kind of figure it out, and then actually the shared knowledge is not actually maybe as tight as you would think. But yeah, no, well, I mean, like I really hope that strategy works for you, because there are some amazing people, there are amazing graduates that come out of the local universities.
Yeah, yeah. And my approach has always been that like it's easier to take the kind of enthusiasm and desire to learn and like that kind of attitude of like, okay, I don't know this, but teach me, um, and sculpt and then give them the tools or the support that they need to like really get the most out of them than it is perhaps to take someone that's senior, but will say, well, I do this tech and this and that, but I'm not going to touch this, or I'm not going to do any DevOps, or I'm not going to do that. Now, like obviously, you don't. I'm not saying that every senior engineer is like that, but I've definitely found that in the kind of hiring cycles, there's um, maybe sort of in the earlier stages of people's career, they're willing to sort of try a bit of everything, and that's worked quite well for us at our early stage. I think it's probably a stage thing as well because you know, 18 months ago we had no lines of code. We just had a thing that we knew we wanted to build. We had an idea of how it all plugged together from a technology point of view. Um, one example of that is, I suppose, one example of the decisions we made is that we decided to be Node, TypeScript across the board, front end, back end, because I thought, look, I want to hire some TypeScript engineers, some JavaScript engineers, and know that I could put them absolutely anywhere that's needed. And that's starting to creak a little bit now.
It's
But
funny how that happens.
yeah, right. Um, it's sort of it's still one of the things I'm clinging on to is not sort of going, well, actually, this tech or this language is going to be better for this problem, and then I have to get a team that can do that. Now that is an interesting one because that could be back to the AI. Could be something that I think it'd be easier to find someone who's a very experienced, TypeScript engineer and say, look, we're going to start porting some of this over to Python or Rails or Java or whatever it is. Use AI as your teacher and run with that. But yeah, it's been an interesting one with because what we do, there's blockchain related to it. We initially set out saying, well, let's try and hire some blockchain experts, to really come in. And really, although we could find a few of those people, very much they were it's probably just people we found, but they were very much of the attitude of, well, okay, I'm going to join you and I'll do your blockchain stuff, but I'm not going to go and build you a Next.js app, or I'm not going to go and dip in and update some, backend, Express.js code. So we would sort of say, well, okay, well, let's take the people we have and give them a real crash course on the fundamentals of blockchain and some of the integrations that we do. Because ultimately, you'll relate to this, Alan. It's like whatever the technology, whether it's AI, blockchain, anything else, usually you can break it down to some APIs that do some things and some data that goes from here to here. It's very much the same with blockchain, really. I mean, obviously, I'm hugely oversimplifying, everything, but at its core, you can say, right, well, let's start with like, what do the interfaces look like, and then move from there. And it's such
Oh
a
no, I completely agree. Like, I mean, it's basic building blocks, but it's how you build those basic building blocks into
yeah,
something magical.
yeah, exactly. And it's all about making it so that you it's taking those building blocks and putting one on top of the other in a way that you're building sort of a foundation and not sort of stacking them, all over the place. We're sort of supporting multiple blockchains at the moment as well for different use cases and different geographical regions and various reasons. Trying to build this platform in a way that means it's really easy to plug in another blockchain or another type of wallet or another token type, has been kind of the big challenge really, in making it all sort of common. It was, when I said there was no lines of code 18 months ago, it was not strictly true because there was an agency before I joined who had built like a pretty good MVP that was a very thin slice. But of course, the questions were then coming, okay, now we want to change it to another blockchain, can we? no, not with this, not the way this has been done. And it was very good for proving out a use case and probably raising the C round. But when I came in, it was every leadership team hates hiring the CTO that says, "I'm sorry, we're going to start again." But that's what we did really. And we what we've got now is pretty robust, and we're using it for a number of different use cases in a number of different regions. So it's broadly, touch wood, doing what it needs to do. But it's getting those building blocks right is the challenge.
So I mean, that starting afresh must have been a really interesting challenge. So like, how did you think about those sort of more of the tools and frameworks and platforms? And are you like you cloud based?
Yes, cloud-based, again, we kind of decided early on to go fully cloud-based, build everything, on the infrastructure in the cloud, try and do everything, infrastructure as code as well to make so we, didn't have to be getting people that, had to maintain certain states or had like assumed knowledge. We set up with that from the beginning. Where we've got certain blockchain technology, we have to run nodes as well. So we try and run those in our sort of ecosystem as well. We run them on the cloud as well. And that can be interesting as well because you're trying to run some of these machines can be quite sort of, intensive, and they're part of a big network doing lots of transactions. But it gives us that edge in that we have our own nodes that we can communicate with. So like stepping back from the blockchain, we're largely building. It's really like it started off as a sort of a UI with a very simple back end that was a thin wrapper to kind of do things on and off the blockchain. It's very much in the 18 months changed to be a sort of a platform. We call it sort of our platform, which is a set of APIs which allow you to tokenize and trade and sell and buy and find out various information, including things like listing your own, listing your assets to sell. And then what we initially built sort of to plug into that was a set of almost like micro front ends, not the wrong term really, but very small sort of MVP UIs that would use our APIs to do very specific use cases, whether it's like property or for a certain customer listing a certain type of assets. We could bake some of the kind of the journeys, if you like, into these apps, and then it would just plug into our platform. In January, we decided it's one of those things, what it's like as a startup, you sort of cast your net, put a few MVPs out there and see which ones land. And, happily for us, but also slight headache for us was that, we found that actually sort of 3 main ones landed really well and stuck. And we had to take a step back and go, well, okay, we hadn't really planned to support 3 sort of products on the front end. How can we make these sort of common and core? So that's our big sort of roadmap item right now. Is we're building a UI called Unity, which is supposed to be sort of the one interface that everyone will use to go in and out. And if you're a property seller or buyer, you have a certain set of feature flags which will give you a certain experience versus we're doing something different. But it's all SaaS, it's all cloud. There's nothing sort of on-prem or anything like that. So that's interesting. And it's also quite interesting because we are often working with quite traditional companies, traditional finance type companies who will often ask us about, do we do on-prem, or do we, how will we set this?
Yes, we've been asked, do you do on-prem? Like every week since we started, and we were like, Cloudsmith is in the name of the
It's
company.
literally in the name.
So,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's an interesting one, and we get all kinds of sort of, I'm sure you found this too, that when you're you're obviously in the very much the space of security and supply chain. We're very much in the compliance, need to be regulated. There's a lot of boxes you have to tick in terms of security and ISO, and we know DORA. Have you had to do anything for DORA yet in the island?
No,
Oh,
not.
okay.
I don't think so. I d- well, let me answer that again. I don't think so, but that doesn't mean that we're not looking into it.
Yeah. I
Um,
believe if you're doing ISO, you get most of you're sort of ticking most of DORA's boxes by default, is what I'm told. Whether that's the case or not, I don't know. But it's just interesting because we sort of go full circle on this. We sort of set out as a as a technology function and say, well, let's make sure we're doing security best practices and designing this way and building this way. And then our sort of compliance team who are trying to get us our various regulatory frameworks in various jurisdictions will go around the house and they'll come to me and say, oh, they've said we need to be ISO. We said we need to be DORA compliant. And you'll say, okay, let's go. We're on it. But, there's a give and take here. So we'll then try and work out exactly what it is being asked for and where. But it does make for an interesting challenge.
yeah, no, and I think we're seeing compliance being more important than ever, uh, and security and supply chain management are leading more to compliance than just being, a function that things need to be secure. So, a number of our customers are trying to go for FedRAMP, and there's a whole list of like, how do you know, make sure you know the provenance of the assets that you're assets and artifacts that you're bringing into your system, and so Cloudsmith has become kind of a key tool for solving some of that. So actually, we're not as far apart as you might think. What has traditionally been fintech government has definitely started to bleed out into the private sector.
And you can see just in the news, like in today, actually, I heard the co-op apparently have had a security breach or something. And then it was Marks and Spencer's at the weekend, and there was another one, I think. And you're starting to realize that, I think these sometimes very big organizations that maybe thought, oh, well, it doesn't matter as much for us. And I'm sure they wouldn't say that publicly. But what I mean is the people that think, well, this is for the banks to care about, they're starting to realize that it really can wreck your business if you're offline for a week, or co-op telling people not to send messages internally because they could be being read by malicious actors and things. It's a very interesting time. I think security is going to become more and more of a um, you know something that gets taken seriously from day one of any startup and any tech business, rather than something that's sort of bolted on at the end.
Yeah, no, we've always thought it was really interesting that um, when you go for investment, like the first thing that the VCs ask for is like, what open source are you using, and and do you have the licenses to own it, and so almost at the very very beginning, you need to know what open source you're bringing in, and how you're utilizing it.
Yeah, it was interesting. Even like Grazi, bear in mind the business was less than a year old, and it was just me. And when the acquisition was going, one of the first things that I got asked was, please, yeah, exactly that, a list of all your open source software and what licenses. And I remember thinking, oh no, like I haven't thought about this, but it's really fascinating. And we had like I won't name the party, but we had a vendor contact us this week, say we've had a supply chain attack.
Yeah, no, we see a lot of companies struggle with things like that. Bits of code getting put into open source, put on a public registry, and quite interestingly, a lot of the time it's then removed so that it only exists in a kind of historical version, and then it would get pulled, and then it can kind of easily get patched, but you don't really know what the blast radius of the damage is and how long. Like, I think there's some crazy statistic about uh like how often the Log4j package is still downloaded to this day. Like even with all the controls and checks and um and I assume that it has been pulled down from the public registry. At Cloudsmith, we immediately put in a block so that none of our customers could download that. And now we have a whole enterprise policy management feature set where you can actually write your own rules to basically prevent things like that. But no, it's a big problem.
It's just interesting to see, like, I mean, I don't know any tech organization now, including banks. I did quite a lot of work with banks when I was consulting that aren't using open source somewhere. Like, there must be a very small number that aren't using it anywhere. And I think, some are probably taking it very seriously and doing everything they should to manage their software supply chain. But, I'm sure a lot aren't, especially those ones that are just, it's maybe some ancillary part over here. They think, well, that's fine. It's just it's just a widget that plugs in. It's just I don't know, an intercom widget or something. Yeah, sure. But, what's that pulling in with it, and what's it got access to once it's in your code? It's a really interesting one as well. And I'm trying to get our software engineers to just be mindful of that. We have some sort of, controls in place, but I also want them to just think about it as well, rather than blindly adding, some package because they've read about it on Stack Overflow, like actually go and sort of interrogate it and look at whether it's proper and legitimate.
There's definitely, that's definitely the first step, is a sort of mindset, shift of like really thinking about it and making sure that, and then it's about, tooling and observing and, and audit trails and all of that, is sort of how you can ultimately manage it. But it's not it's not an easy problem to solve. And that's not just like, and Cloudsmith only solves a certain, part of it. There's a lot of tooling in and around it that is required in order to, takes a village to solve the problem. If it even is solvable. That's, there's so many things that you can do and so many checks and balances, but at the same time, at the end of the day, you can try and reduce your risk as much as possible, but it's very, very difficult to solve it so that nothing could happen.
Yeah, this is it. It's an interesting callback maybe to the aerospace engineering bit, because I remember doing, on that, you have to think of a bolt that goes into a jet engine has so much QA on it. It costs you way more than a bolt you go and get down at B&Q for obvious reasons, and it's partly the materials, but it's also all the, every one of those will be sort of kite marked and checked, and there'll be a full audit trail, a QA history all the way back to the the smelting plant where the metal was created to make sure it's the right grade and everything. And it's like, obviously they've had hundreds of years to kind of work out these systems. We've not. But even then things fail. But it's interesting because what they've got there is part of the reason why it's very slow and very expensive, and why it takes 7 years to go from a jet engine on a design to actually being on a plane. So much regulation and safety. Obviously that's really important, incredibly important. And we sort of need to get somewhere closer to that as software developers, but not so close that it takes us 7 years to ship an update. I don't know what the answer is, or whether, as you say, whether it's even solvable, but
Well, it is interesting. It's a really good analog to aerospace and sort of and software. I actually had a bit of a background in aerospace as well. I was like MRO, maintenance, repair, and overhaul type software at the start of my career, and a lot of that was to manage which parts worked with which parts. So, the FAA would put out these sort of technical directives of like what parts were valid against other parts. And like basically software is kind of the same. It's like, which, the CVEs come out and, you know, uh, and give you a view of what software's safe and what's not. And you basically are trying to thread the needle through all of that, not noise, but, initiatives to kind of find the sort of the safe path. So, those are very similar concepts.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, I was thinking with this, the saying about the CVs and threading that as well. We've a very small React Native app as well, which we use for like a very specific use case, and it's always kind of irks me a little bit. You get all the your dependabot or whatever it is will tell you all your things that need to be patched, but a lot of them are just in the build pipeline. You say, well, okay, it's not actually in any software that's distributed. It'll tell you that there's some query parameter vulnerability, and you go, well, yeah, but there's no way someone can use that because it's in the build pipeline or something, and that's easy for me to say because I want to ignore it, but it's and I think I understand it a bit, but it can be a bit of a blunt instrument, is what I'm saying. Is that if you try and get your vulnerabilities to zero, you know it, that that's often something that's just not possible to do in certain cases. Um, so we try and be kind of pragmatic, but also not so pragmatic that we leave a big gaping hole in the side. That's the hard bit, I think.
Well, I think you're probably representing every CTO and CISO out there, because like it does have to be tempered with pragmatism, but there's a lot of tools out there that can kind of help, and that's it's picking the right one and making sure you have the right partner to make that work. I've really enjoyed the conversation so far, Jack. Have you any questions for me?
Yeah, it's been great. Thanks, Alan. Yeah, one question I'd love to ask is obviously Glenn stepped into the role of CEO relatively recently. I'd love to know a bit more how that was for you going from founder to bring in a CEO and some of the kind of challenges and benefits that came with that.
Yeah, Glenn likes to remind me that it's like 20 months, like it's fairly recently has now turned into kind of beyond a year and a half, which is kind of unbelievable. It has flown in. Um, yeah, no, I'm happy to chat about that. Lee and I obviously founded the company, and kind of built it up, and we went global sort of from the get go. It's cloud. It's a developer platform, and so we started to pick up customers kind of all over the world very early on. So like our first big enterprise was in Australia, and then what happened, which we kind of expected, was obviously we were selling in Europe, but the US became kind of our biggest market, and there was like basically this sort of seismic shift of like quarter on quarter went from 50% to 55% to 60%, and so there was just sort of it felt like the gravity was kind of moving to the States. And at Series A, we had taken on American investors as well, so that also was kind of part of it. And I always like to think that, and rightly or wrongly, we kind of always felt like we were kind of building an American startup in Belfast, and trying to, build it, in a way that was kind of like sort of fast moving and sort of, the old Zuckerberg of like move fast and break things type approach. And, and we'd done that. And I think the lessons we learned were, that there's sort of different people for different stages of the company. And I kind of had felt like I was a pretty early stage CEO, and kind of when we got to a certain size, I kind of felt like it made sense to kind of take a step back and bring in somebody who was, had scaled a business before, and could really sort of drive us forward. So there was a conversation with the board, and we agreed that it was the right thing to do. And then that started a process, and I always think it was funny because like the first. Like we brought on this sort of American recruiter, Jason at Diversa Partners, and he was like, "Alan, if you do everything right, you can have a new CEO in place in about 4 months." And I was like, great, okay. And we did not do everything right, but we did actually end up with the CEO in place in 4 months. And Glenn was great in terms of like, I think he had wanted a break between roles, and I was like, no, you need to come now. Um, and that was a really interesting process. Like we were actually really lucky in terms of the timing, because I do remember we Glenn was actually one of in the first batch of maybe about 30 candidates that we had to review. We didn't interview all 30, but we sort of whittled it down, and Glenn was maybe one of 6 or 7. And then we took about 3 or 4 of those into sort of a second stage interview. And like, we were trying to be efficient, and we had scheduled them all essentially on the same day, one after the other. And I remember just like thinking, oh my goodness, like I'm not looking forward to the next, 5 hours of talking to all these people. But then I looked at the calendar and Glenn was first, and I was like, oh, but I don't mind chatting to Glenn. We had such a good conversation the first time round. And I was like, wait a minute, that means something. That was like, um, and he ticked all the boxes. Like we wanted an American, we wanted somebody who had been a founder and exited. He wanted to come from, kind of, a good gig in corporate America, and he came from Twilio. I wanted him to be impressive. I kept thinking about, if I have to go to, and that was the other thing, like, I mean, a lot of this was happening in the background, so the staff didn't really know that we were kind of, because you don't want to upset people, and you kind of want to manage it carefully, and ultimately come in and go, here's the plan, here is the solution. And, I just kept thinking, like, if I don't put somebody impressive in front of them, they're just going to think that, the business is going to fail, and, they'll all leave. Um, so that was really important to me. And, sort of lucky we found Glenn, we got on well. I flew to America I flew to New York to give him the offer in person. He had come to Belfast as well, actually, to sort of, he met, at that point I had, some of the the leaders in the business, that, Lee and Paul McKeever and a couple of people had chatted to him then. And then I flew to New York, gave him the offer, and then he came back to Belfast. The funny thing is, I kind of thought that the gravitational pull would mean that Cloudsmith would sort of move across the Atlantic, but he loved Belfast so much, he now spends half his time here. He does three weeks here, and then goes home for 3 weeks.
That's great. I mean, I've seen on LinkedIn, he should get some kickback from the Northern Irish Tourist Board.
No, absolutely.
Wow, I want to live in Belfast. Oh wait, I do live in Belfast.
And then just, in terms of the story of the last 18 months, it's been great. He's been a great ambassador for America, a great ambassador for Northern Ireland, great ambassador for, he won, I was kind of proud of this because I wrote the entry. He won Business Personality at Digital DNA last year. And to be honest, I kind of positioned it as, I'm not going to lie, I felt pretty smug about the whole thing, but I kind of positioned it like it was a new paradigm for, sort of Belfast, Northern Ireland companies to kind of build to a certain stage and then kind of hand it over to somebody who knows what they're doing. And I think that could work for other people too, because I mean, there's so much talent in Northern Ireland and in Belfast, and really kind of harnessing that. And we've been very lucky that we've Rory McIlroy winning the golf, and and that puts a sort of spotlight on our little country. But at the same time, there's so much like good technical people here. lots of ideas, lots of spirit of building, you know, but they don't all have to take it all away. You know, there is this way of kind of passing off the baton to somebody else and getting them to take it forward. So no, it has worked out amazingly well.
That's really good. That's really interesting to hear. I really agree with what you said about the gravitational pull bit as well, because we more or less had this, Control Alt is we're obviously way earlier, but it was founded in London. Um, the the COO actually worked. Now he's from Armagh originally, but he was living and working in London, and met the founder Matt Ong in the banking jobs. They decided they set this up. So actually, Matt was the founder. He went off and did it kind of solo for a few months, or for nearly a year, I think, and then raised money to bring the first few people in. But he brought in someone from Armagh who was living in London, and then the next hire was someone in London. He brought in someone working for Matt Atchison, who's our CPO. He was working for Revolut in London, but happens to be from Belfast originally. Well, actually from Ballyclare, I think. But and so basically, then they introduced to me, who sounded like I was living in London, but actually live here and have been here for 10 years. So sort of organically, naturally, we ended up with, I think, 3 out of the 5 leadership team sort of living in Northern Ireland. And so when it came to sort of hiring an engineering team, I just thought, well, I'm just going to hire where I know has got great talent. There's great sort of support for startups. Like Invest and I have been really good as well. They've been really helpful. Having that link to Ireland, so we have to be regulated in the EU. We have to have an EU base. We looked at Luxembourg. We looked at other places. Just made sense to drive down the road to Dundalk. So we have an office in Dundalk, and that means we've got a nice relationship there, and that we've got a handful of staff based in or near Dundalk, and we can get there really easily. So it just seemed like, why would we look anywhere else? And that's been really interesting, because we've now got this company that's, Notion, the H-quartered in London, does so much of our work and so much of our kind of foundation it's built in Northern Ireland. And it's just been really interesting to see that. And obviously, as someone who wasn't born here and moved here 10 years ago, think, well, I'm not going to go and
Good move.
No, I'm not going anywhere. But it's an interesting thing, the kind of the psychology of people who are born here, because they'll say, "Why did you move to Northern Ireland?" with this sort of look on their face. And I try and tell them it's a great place to live, and also a great place to work.
Yeah. Well, look, thank you so much for your time today. It's been great having you on the podcast, and maybe you'll come back at some point and we can discuss more.
Certainly will. Thank you so much for having me. It's been really good chatting. Great to catch up.